that they wait for them. The man who made the suggestion told the other vassals that there is a limit to the amount of food they can requisition from the citizens. He said that they can barely suppress public unrest by using the army. He told the others that he is not certain if they can hold out until support arrives. The man turned to his lord and told him that it will be bad for them if the military grain runs out and the soldiers begin to starve. He said that the iron fortress, which has never been breached before, will be destroyed by an internal uprising. Count Cabaldi was shocked to hear this. He couldn't believe that his vassals wanted him to crawl to Ghislain. He grit his teeth and put himself together. With a nervous look on his face, he ordered his subordinates to give Fenris iron in exchange for food. The vassals who were against the idea called out to their lord. Count Cabaldi clenched his fist and said that Ghislain will die by the hands of the ducal house. He said that the result won't change even if he gives them some iron. While smiling like a lunatic, the count said that the ducal house or Count Desmond can come to his fortress if they have a problem with him. He told his vassals that no one can take over his fortress. He turned to a guard and asked him to send a messenger to Fenris before everyone starves to death. The guard told him that there is no need for this. He revealed to the count that Baron Fenris is already at their gate with his army. Count Cabaldi was shocked to hear this. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. The scene shifts, and we are taken outside the castle. We see Ghislain and his knights marching towards the gate. The knights were all wearing the same armors. Gordon said that the armor is just too small for him. Torin asked him to shut up. He told him that they used twice as many blood python scales for him. Gordon tapped his breastplate. He told the man that he now has mana flowing through him. He said that no one can scratch his perfect muscles now. The moment he said this, someone hit him in his chest. The man felt some pain in his chest. The person who hit him was Ghislain. Our boy said that the dwarves make really sturdy armors. He moved forward with his badass horse and ordered his soldiers to march forward.
Under Ghislain's command, the Fenris Order of Knights marched toward Cavalli Castle. From atop the ancient fortress's thick stone walls, Count Cavalli and his vassals beheld a terrifying sight. The Fenris troops stretched endlessly across the fields like a dark tide. The steel of their armor glimmered faintly beneath the bleak sunlight, and their banners fluttered in grim silence. Cavalli's vassals panicked, their faces pale with fear. One of them stammered that Fenris's army had surrounded the entire castle. The moat that had once been their strongest line of defense had long dried up under the relentless drought, leaving them utterly exposed. The men exchanged anxious glances, whispering among themselves as dread took hold. They wondered aloud what kind of force this was. Such an army was far beyond what a single barony could possibly muster. Some speculated that the royalists might have secretly provided him with troops. Trying to maintain the dignity of his rank, Count Cavalli told his men not to panic. With a forced, trembling smile, he tried to sound confident as he asked what those troops could possibly do before the might of his castle. His voice wavered slightly as he claimed that if they deployed their powerful weapons, the Fenris army would never even reach the castle's shadow. His words offered fleeting reassurance, though doubt still clouded his vassal's eyes. From a distance, Ghislain raised his voice and called out to Count Cavalli, asking if he had read the letter that had been sent to him. Already seething at the audacity of seeing an army at his gates, Cavalli shouted back in fury, demanding to know what this outrage meant and how Baron Fenris dared to march upon his castle without warning. His voice echoed across the walls, thick with disbelief and rage. Yet Ghislain remained calm, his demeanor cold and steady as steel. In a measured tone, he stated that he had already made his intentions clear. He reminded them that he had warned the Count of the regret that would follow if the market remained closed. Though his words were not shouted, they carried such weight that silence fell over the scene for a brief moment. Hearing Ghislain's declaration, Count Cavalli's vassals could no longer restrain their fury. Their fists clenched as they shouted down from the battlements, demanding to know whether Ghislain truly believed that stringing together bold words could justify a cause for war. Their anger flared, for such audacity was a grave insult to noble dignity and could not be tolerated. Count Cavalli himself, his pride burning hotter than reason, declared that if Ghislain wished for war, then he should prepare a proper justification and issue a formal declaration. He added that he would not associate with anyone who disrespected noble etiquette in such a disgraceful manner. Though his voice remained stern, it trembled faintly, betraying both the sting of insult and the weight of the situation. But Ghislain's gaze only grew sharper, and his tone colder than ever. He said that if the Count desired a declaration of war, he would receive one here and now. Calling out to Gillian, he ordered him to bring a bow and an arrow. Without hesitation, Gillian obeyed, presenting the weapon with solemn reverence. Ghislain took it, and as he set the arrow upon the string, a deep silence fell over the field. The air thickened with tension. Even the birds seemed to have fled the sky. Count Cavalli, seeing Ghislain ready his bow, felt his heart pound violently. Fear seized him, and he immediately ordered his knights to raise their shields and form a wall before him. The clatter of armor rang out as they obeyed. Jillian, however, quietly cautioned Ghislain that the walls were high and the distance far, but Ghislain showed no sign of hesitation. His horse, as if sharing its master's will, lowered itself slightly to give him a better angle for the shot. The moment felt almost sacred, as though fate itself anointed him. With a single decisive motion, Ghislain released the arrow. The bowstring twanged, and the arrow cut through the air, slicing the silence apart. It first struck the shield of a knight standing before the count, piercing through and driving into the man's head, felling him instantly. Yet the arrow did not stop. It grazed past the count's ear, leaving behind a shallow cut that began to bleed. Count Cavalli stumbled back in shock, his eyes wide with horror as he realized how narrowly death had missed him. Ghislain lowered his bow, his voice resounding like thunder as he declared that this was his declaration of war. The scene then shifted to the capital, Cardinia. Within the grand halls, the royalist faction convened an urgent meeting. News of the conflict spread swiftly, and the chamber erupted into heated debate. Someone exclaimed that Baron Fenris had begun a war. Count Alsbury, his brow furrowed with concern, remarked that thanks to Ghislain's earlier counsel, they had survived the famine by storing grain. But to start a war now, in such a time of hardship, was an act of reckless folly. Marquis Burford, sharp and probing, demanded to know the pretext for such a war. Rosalind, calm yet grave, explained that Count Cavalli had refused to open the iron market to Fenris and the neighboring territories. The refusal revealed that Cavalli had been trading almost monopolistically with Desmond's lands, a scheme that threatened the fragile balance among the nobles. Count Alsbury remarked that one could always find or manufacture a pretext for action if necessary, yet admitted that such a move felt dangerously reckless. The army commander then interjected in a firm tone, asserting that this revelation left no room for doubt. Ghislain had to be expelled from the faction before matters escalated beyond control. His vassals nodded in agreement, voicing their full support with unwavering conviction. One of them added that all efforts ought to be devoted to recovering from the drought rather than fueling a war that would only deplete their already weakened resources. But the High Judge, leaning back with a casual air, questioned whether the army commander had simply disliked that young man from the very beginning. The remark struck sharply, leaving the commander momentarily flustered as he struggled to respond without betraying his true feelings. Sensing the growing tension, Rosalind intervened swiftly, urging everyone to calm themselves. She reminded them that the incident had already occurred and that their task now was to find a solution to break the current deadlock. Endless arguments, she said, would only waste precious time. The army commander retorted that he was calm, exceedingly calm, and insisted that the war was nothing but bait set for the Duke's house to exploit. At that very moment, the chamber doors opened and Count Faude of the Duke's house entered. His confident steps and commanding presence immediately drew every gaze. He declared in a sharp tone that he agreed with the commander's assessment. The room fell into stunned silence. The nobles were taken aback by Count Faude's sudden appearance. Marquis Burford, clearly displeased, narrowed his eyes and demanded to know what Faude was doing there. In response, Count Faude stated that Baron Fenris had attacked Count Cavalli, who was a neutral noble, and that such an act, committed while the realm was still suffering from natural disaster, could hardly be considered the collective will of the royalist faction. His words hung heavy in the air. Marcus Burford fixed him with a cold, calculating stare, weighing his motives carefully. The High Judge, observing the exchange, mused inwardly that the Duke's intelligence network truly was formidable. Count Alsbury thought to himself that the Duke's house had shown its hand boldly from the very start. A sign, perhaps, that they were confident in their position. Rosalind reflected silently that this incident could drive all the neutral nobles to turn against the royalists. Such a shift, she realized, would grant the Duke's house an ideal opportunity to assert dominance. It was no exaggeration to say that her father's next words might decide the faction's fate. If Baron Ghislain were to be defeated, the royalists would lose their influence in the north. Yet even if they chose to withdraw, the outcome would still be the same. Their weakness would be exposed. However, if Baron Fenris managed to claim Cavalli's largest northern iron mine, the royalists could obtain a reward great enough to justify the risk. At last, Marquis Burford spoke in a composed tone, declaring that the justification for war was sound. Count Faude, momentarily taken aback, demanded to know what exactly the Marquis meant by that. Burford replied that this was merely a personal conflict between Baron Fenris and Count Cavalli. It did not represent the royalists' will, and thus the Duke's house had no grounds to intervene. Hearing this, Count Faude grew visibly unsettled. He argued that there was a proper time and place for war, and that to stand idly by now would be equivalent to abandoning their duty as royalist nobles to uphold the kingdom's order. Though his voice remained sharp, it carried an unmistakable note of desperation. Marquis Branford sighed with clear disdain, remarking that he could not comprehend why the Duke's house was so overly sensitive about the issue, as though the county were nothing more than their puppet. Meanwhile, on the battlefield at Count Cavalli's castle, the air was heavy with the stench of blood and fear. The Count screamed in agony, clutching his wounded ear as blood stained his hand. Gislin, recalling Gillian's earlier warning about the height of the walls, acknowledged his subordinate's foresight and praised him briefly for his excellent judgment. Nearby, Kyer smirked and muttered under his breath that the Count would never wear earrings again. The Knights of Cavalli descended into chaos. Some shouted for help to stop the bleeding, while others rushed to shield their lord. Confusion rippled through the battlements, yet despite the searing pain, Count Cavalli regained his composure. Grinding his teeth, he roared in fury, commanding all troops to take their positions and prepare to make the enemy taste their blood. He proclaimed that the majesty of Cavalli Castle, unbroken through all of history, would not fall on that day. His words reignited the troops' morale, and they hurried to their stations. The ballistae were drawn and loaded, their ropes straining under tension as the sound of preparation filled the air. Watching from Gislin's side, Gillian reported that the enemy forces were preparing to attack. Gislin nodded calmly, noting that they were masters of defense, and it was only natural for their reaction to be swift. His tone carried no trace of concern or fear, only a composed certainty born of control and confidence. Soon after, the soldiers of Cavalli announced that the ballistae were ready. Count Cavalli, his voice unbroken despite the pain, gave the order to fire. A storm of arrows and bolts was unleashed, darkening the sky as thousands of projectiles descended upon the Fenris troops like an iron tempest. The spectacle was one of terror and destruction, a rain of death meant to obliterate all in its path. Yet Gislin and his knights did not falter. They stood unmoving, as though the deadly barrage were nothing more than a gentle summer rain. At the final moment, Gislin gave a command for his troops to raise their shields. In perfect harmony, steel rose in unison. Gislin himself lifted his sword and effortlessly deflected an arrow mid-flight. Gillian mirrored his precision, and Kyer parried with equal grace. Their movements displayed an unshakable discipline and mastery. When the storm of arrows finally ceased and the dust settled, not a single knight of Fenris had fallen. Their formation remained unbroken, untouched amidst the wreckage, while shattered arrow shafts littered the ground around them. From atop his walls, Count Cavalli watched in disbelief, his rage and shock consuming him. His confidence, once towering, now trembled at its foundation. Gislin sheathed his sword slowly, every motion deliberate. Raising his voice, he asked whether this feeble assault was truly all the Count had to offer, his words cutting deeper than any blade. Then, in a tone of cold authority, he ordered his troops to withdraw to their main position and prepare for the next phase of the operation. While the group was relaxing, Claude laughed, remarking that his lord had chosen the perfect moment to engage in battle. He then turned to Wendy, asking if she agreed, and commented that the cavalry territory probably hadn't stockpiled food the way they had. According to him, if they simply waited, victory was all but certain. Alfoy, looking discouraged, wondered aloud why Gislin had even brought the mages along. Claude brushed off the question, saying it didn't matter. Since the mages had already exhausted their energy constructing the garrison, they could rest for now. He leaned back against a supply crate, stretched his arms, and sighed contentedly, saying it felt good to finally relax and do nothing for a change. Turning to Alfoy, he suggested they play a game together. Trying to shake off his gloomy mood, Alfoy showed some interest and asked what the wager would be. Before Claude could answer, the tent flap was suddenly thrown open and Gislin entered, his expression dark and commanding as he ordered Claude to step outside. Both Claude and Alfoy froze in surprise. Claude blinked in confusion, asking why Gislin was already back, but Gislin ignored him and strode past, instructing Alfoy sharply to gather all the mages at once. His tone left no room for refusal. Gislin then declared that from that moment onward, they would begin digging tunnels toward the cavalry castle. The announcement left Alfoy wide-eyed in shock. Claude frowned, clearly puzzled, pointing out that they could win simply by maintaining their current position and questioning whether such effort was truly necessary. But Gislin replied with unwavering determination that they couldn't afford to just wait. If they wished to end things before the Duke's house could send reinforcements to Cavalli, they had to take action immediately. Soon after, Gislin reached the forward camp outside Cavalli territory. His eyes were cold and resolute as he looked toward the distant fortress walls, quietly stating that the war would end sooner than Cavalli could imagine. Meanwhile, inside the fortress, Count Cavalli grimaced as he tended to his wound. He cursed Gislin as an insolent brat for daring to run off after having pierced the ears of his noble self. His vassals stood around him, their faces tight with anger and frustration. One of the men remarked that, faced with Gislin's overwhelming firepower, they would have been helpless regardless of their efforts. He reasoned that the enemy must have switched to a delaying tactic, aware that the cavalry territory lacked sufficient food supplies. Count Cavalli clenched his teeth in anger and demanded of one of his vassals whether he was suggesting that Gislen intended to wait until they surrendered. Yet, he reminded them that the Duke's house stood behind the Cavalli domain. With a dark laugh, the Count declared that the Duke's house would never abandon the largest northern iron mine under his control. He was certain that reinforcements would arrive. All they needed to do was hold out until then. At that moment, a soldier burst into the room, saluted sharply, and reported that it appeared Gislin's forces were digging beneath them. The Count stiffened in disbelief. Seizing a telescope, he peered through it, his jaw tightening as he saw the Fenris troops working openly in the field. He was incredulous at their audacity. One of his vassals commented that since the Fenris army couldn't take the castle head-on, they must be attempting an underground assault. Another vassal quickly added that, given the structure of their castle's foundation, the only place the enemy could possibly emerge would be near the south gate. Count Cavalli's eyes gleamed as a plan swiftly formed in his mind. He commanded his knight Jah to station troops at the south gate and ordered that the moment the enemy surfaced, his men were to strike all at once. Once confusion spread among the attackers, they would open the gates and send out the cavalry to annihilate the Fenris troops completely. John then asked what they should do about the walls, to which the Count scoffed, questioning what the enemy could possibly achieve without siege engines. He remarked that since they were mostly infantry and cavalry, a minimal garrison would be sufficient to defend the fortifications. Count Cavalli laughed again, his voice echoing coldly through the chamber. Though taken by surprise, he believed he would ultimately be the one to prevail. As night slowly descended, outside, the dwarves toiled tirelessly, sweat glistening on their foreheads despite the chill in the air. One of them muttered that their lord had ordered them to haul the strange contraption all the way there. Another complained that without fire, it was difficult to see what lay ahead. A dwarf called out to Galbraith, asking whether they had constructed the device exactly as their lord had requested, but wondered aloud if it was even ready for real use. Galbraith, brimming with confidence, grinned and asserted that there was no way anything he built would fail. He recalled how, when Gislen had declared his desire to fly in the sky, every dwarf had been intrigued. Galbraith had asked him if he had somehow discovered the legendary hot aircraft blueprint, the lost technology of the ancient empire. Gislen had only laughed and asked what that was, telling them that they would soon understand once they saw his creation. He then produced a large piece of cloth and held it over a fire. As smoke filled the fabric, it began to lift gradually. The dwarves' eyes widened in disbelief. Galbraith frowned, staring intently and demanding to know what exactly he was supposed to be looking at. Gislen told him to focus on the cloth itself, on how it swelled and lifted. The heated air, he explained, rose and filled the inside of the cloth sack. Though hot air escaped through a small opening, the fabric remained inflated. Galbraith, transfixed, murmured that if it were mere wind, the cloth would have fluttered sideways. Instead, it rose upward, and that, he realized, was something entirely different. Gislen let out a faint, amused laugh when he heard Galbraith's sudden realization. Then he knelt and drew the shape of an air balloon on the ground, suggesting that if they made an airbag much larger than this, it could. Before he could even finish, Galbraith had already snatched the stick from his hand. Excitement blazed in Galbraith's eyes as he began sketching rapidly, explaining that if a basket were attached beneath the bag, people could ride inside it and float using hot air. He then bombarded Gislen with a series of questions, demanding to know why this phenomenon occurred, and why hot air rose in the first place. Gislen scratched his head, clearly embarrassed, and admitted that he didn't actually know. He had discovered it by accident while lighting a fire to dry laundry. Galbraith stared at him in disbelief and asked how he could witness something so trivial and immediately come up with such an idea. Then, with a grin, he told Gislen to follow him. When Gislen blinked in confusion and asked where they were going, Galbraith replied excitedly that they were heading to his workshop. He wanted to build the thing right away and test it. Later that night, in the present time, the dwarves were stealthily transporting the massive air balloon to its designated site under the cover of darkness. The moonlight shimmered faintly across the fabric, giving it an eerie glow. Gazing at the balloon, Gislen murmured that it was perfect. Galbraith, wiping soot from his hands, smirked and remarked that this was nothing but child's play for dwarves. Belinda approached, carrying Gislen's helmet, and informed him that both the mages and knights were ready. Gislen nodded approvingly and told her to go and make her own preparations as well. Nearby, Alfoy cursed under his breath, complaining that if things were going to end up like this, then there had been no point in digging all those tunnels in the first place.